Alia Carter's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped into the courtroom. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that always seemed to hang in courtrooms, especially when Judge Thomas Reynolds was presiding. She had been here before, many times, in fact, but today felt different. Today, the stakes were higher. Today, she wasn't just the defendant. She was part of something much bigger. The case was simple enough. A zoning violation for an extension to her home that she hadn't realized needed approval. But Alia wasn't here because of the violation. She was here because of what she had uncovered. She had spent months digging into the local judicial system, connecting dots between shady legal decisions and the patterns of favoritism and bribery that had tainted the courts. It wasn't just about her personal case. It was about exposing the corruption that had long been hidden in the very system that was supposed to protect people like her. Judge Reynolds was the type of judge who prided himself on being tough, impartial, and strictly by the book. He was well respected in the community, known for his no-nonsense attitude and a reputation for making tough calls. But Alia knew better. Over the past several weeks, she had come across whispers and leaks, connections, ties, and decisions that hinted at something far darker beneath the surface. It was becoming clear to her that Reynolds was at the center of it all. Her case was called, and she walked up to the defendant's table, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to look nervous, not here. She had spent too many years honing her skills as an investigative journalist, learning how to keep her emotions in check, how to look unflappable even when her world was unraveling. As she sat down, her lawyer offered a reassuring smile, though Alia could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He had no idea what she was really here for. Judge Reynolds entered, his sharp, measured steps echoing through the room. The rustle of papers and murmurs from the gallery quieted as he took his seat. Alia observed him closely as he adjusted his glasses, scanning the case files before him. She had been following his every move for weeks, collecting information on his rulings, his history, his connections to influential figures. But today, he was just the judge presiding over her case. The charges were read, and Alia's lawyer made a brief argument, emphasizing that the violation was minor and unintentional. But the moment the judge spoke, Alia could feel the weight of his gaze on her. His voice was cold and impartial as he handed down the decision. An unusually high fine for a case of this nature. It was almost as if he was trying to make an example of her. Alia kept her composure, but inside, a fire started to burn. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but now the personal stakes were much higher. She didn't expect sympathy, nor did she want it. But she couldn't help feeling that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was a message, a challenge. And Alia Carter wasn't someone who backed down from a fight. Alia Carter was not the type to sit idly by when injustice was staring her in the face. She had always been the curious, determined type, qualities that served her well as an investigative journalist. For years, she had worked under the radar, piecing together stories that often took months to uncover, stories that exposed hidden truths buried deep within the folds of local government, corporate dealings, and social systems. But nothing had prepared her for the web of corruption she was about to unravel. Her investigation into the local justice system had begun with something personal. A few years ago, her family's legal battle, a small dispute over property inheritance, had been dismissed in a court case that seemed to defy logic. The judge, a man named Davis, had ruled in favor of an influential local businessman with close ties to the political elite. It was a seemingly simple case, but the outcome felt like a punch to the gut. Alia knew instinctively that something had gone wrong, that this wasn't a fair ruling. And after months of research, she realized it wasn't just her case. It was the system itself. The more she dug, the more she found connections that made her blood run cold. Bribes, special favors, under-the-table deals between judges, lawyers, and influential local figures. The justice system was supposed to serve the people, but Alia had discovered it was often working against them, especially if you didn't have the right connections. It was then that Alia's focus shifted toward the man at the heart of this corruption, Judge Thomas Reynolds. She had noticed his name coming up time and time again, linked to key rulings that favored the wealthy and well-connected. There were whispers, some from disgruntled staff, others from legal insiders, that Reynolds had been accepting perks and favors in exchange for his decisions. No one had been able to prove anything, but Alia was determined to be the one who would. She didn't take the decision lightly. She knew exposing Reynolds could put her career, and her life, in jeopardy. This wasn't just a story. This was about fighting against a corrupt system that preyed on those who had no voice. And Alia had a voice. More importantly, she had the tools and the drive to make sure that voice was heard. As she continued to gather information, she began to take more risks. She started showing up at Reynolds' court hearings, attending with the keen eye of a journalist rather than a member of the public. She'd sit in the back, watching how he interacted with lawyers, how he seemed to treat certain defendants differently than others, and most importantly, how the people he favored were always the ones with money or power. Despite the growing sense of unease that crept over her each time she stepped into that courtroom, Alia remained focused. She wasn't just looking to expose one corrupt judge. She was looking to tear down a system that had been corrupt for far too long. Reynolds was her first target, but she was determined to follow the story wherever it led, no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks, and Alia became a fixture in Judge Reynolds' courtroom. She wasn't a participant in any case. Instead, she sat in the back row, her eyes scanning the room, taking meticulous notes, her mind always working in overdrive. She watched the judge closely, studying his interactions with lawyers and defendants, noticing the patterns that seemed to repeat themselves. Reynolds' cold, methodical demeanor was always the same, but Alia knew better than to be fooled by appearances. The more she observed, the more certain she became. There was something off about Reynolds. On the surface, his courtroom behavior was impeccable. He was always polite, professional, and gave the impression of impartiality. But it didn't take long for Alia to see the cracks. The way he was particularly lenient with certain defendants, usually those who were well-connected or wealthy, while others, especially those from lower-income neighborhoods, faced harsher sentences. Alia couldn't ignore the patterns anymore. Reynolds was playing favorites, and it wasn't just about the law. It was about power, influence, and money. Alia's curiosity had led her to speak with a few former court employees, clerks, bailiffs, even a couple of lawyers who had crossed paths with Reynolds over the years. It wasn't easy. People in the courthouse had learned to keep their heads down. Corruption ran deep, and anyone who dared question the system risked losing their job, or worse, their safety. But Alia's persistence paid off. She gathered whispers of under-the-table deals, of money changing hands, and of favors exchanged in secret. Reynolds' name kept coming up in every conversation. Some people were more direct than others, but one thing was clear. Judge Reynolds wasn't the man he seemed to be. But Alia knew better than to rush in. This wasn't a story that could be told without solid proof. She needed more than rumors and hearsay. She needed evidence, something undeniable. So she stayed patient. She attended every court session, watched every ruling, and took careful notes. The more she observed, the more her suspicions grew, but Alia wasn't about to make any accusations without the right material to back them up. She couldn't afford to get it wrong. As the weeks went by, Alia began to notice small but significant details. Judge Reynolds' routine was predictable. He had a favorite lunch spot, a particular lawyer he always seemed to favor, and a peculiar habit of spending extra time reviewing certain cases involving high-profile local business people. There were too many coincidences to ignore, and Alia's instincts told her that everything was connected. But she couldn't act on it just yet. Every time she left the courtroom, Alia felt a growing sense of urgency. The truth was out there, just within her reach, but if she wasn't careful, it could slip away. She knew she had to tread lightly. One wrong move, and all her hard work could be for nothing. But her resolve never wavered. She was close. So close, And she couldn't stop now. As Aliyah continued to observe Judge Reynolds, she found herself increasingly frustrated. The evidence was mounting, but there was something elusive about it all. No single moment or decision stood out enough to expose the judge for the corruption she suspected. Instead, it was the small, almost imperceptible details that were starting to form a pattern that suggested the judge's favoring of certain individuals was not a coincidence, but a carefully orchestrated strategy. She had learned, through quiet conversations with courthouse staff, that Reynolds often spent his lunch breaks meeting with the same group of well-dressed business people. Aliyah had even spotted him a few times, sitting in a back booth at the local bistro, laughing as he clinked glasses with a real estate mogul who had a history of financial misdeeds. Each encounter seemed innocent enough, but Aliyah couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on behind those smiles. But the more she dug, the more obstacles she faced. Sources who had once been eager to talk began to clam up. A former clerk who had hinted at knowing something useful stopped answering her calls. A fellow journalist who had worked with her on other stories told her to back off, warning her that the people involved in these schemes were dangerous. Aliyah, however, was undeterred. She had already put too much on the line to turn back now. Despite the growing tension, she knew she couldn't let the pressure push her into rash decisions. She needed a plan. One evening, as she reviewed her notes in her apartment, Aliyah realized she had a key to the puzzle: Reynolds' caseload. She had been meticulous, cataloging every case he had overseen in the past year. And there it was, a glaring inconsistency. Several cases, all involving local businessmen or well-connected figures, had been dismissed with startlingly lenient rulings. These weren't just isolated cases, they were part of a pattern, and the pattern was undeniable. Aliyah knew she had enough to go public, but she also knew the risk involved. Reynolds had powerful allies, lawyers, local politicians, even some members of the police force. A full-fledged investigation into him could quickly turn into a dangerous game of cat and mouse, one that she wasn't sure she was ready to play. Still, the pressure was building. She felt the weight of the story pressing down on her. Every moment that passed without action felt like a missed opportunity. The decision was clear. She needed more concrete evidence, something that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or speculation. She had to dig deeper, get closer to Reynolds without making him aware of her intentions. She needed a way in. The risk of pushing too far into this world of hidden deals and secrets was starting to sink in, but Aliyah was no stranger to danger. She had faced risks in her career before, and each time, she had come out stronger. This time, she wasn't just chasing a story. She was chasing the truth, and there was no turning back. Aliyah's gut told her she was on the brink of something big, something that could finally bring down the corruption she had been chasing for so long. But as much as she believed in the cause, her nerves were beginning to fray. The weight of the investigation was starting to take its toll. She had spent weeks poring over case files, speaking to former colleagues, gathering tidbits of information from sources who were often too afraid to talk openly. The deeper she went, the more she realized how intertwined Judge Reynolds was with the very fabric of local power. It wasn't just one or two shady decisions. It was a whole network of deals and favors that seemed to stretch back years. Then it happened. Aliyah was reviewing a series of emails that she had managed to secure through a trusted source who had worked in the courthouse's administrative office. One of the messages stood out: an email thread between Reynolds and a local developer, Mark Lambert, whose business dealings were known to have benefited from the judge's favorable rulings. The messages were coded, but there was no mistaking the language. Lambert had been thanking Reynolds for helping him move a project forward, a euphemism for influencing decisions related to zoning and land use. But it was the attached document that sent chills down Aliyah's spine. It was a financial summary, with Reynolds' name appearing in a section marked Incentive Payments. It was damning. For weeks, Aliyah had suspected that something was off with the judge. But this was different. This wasn't a vague rumor or an unconfirmed lead. This was proof, hard, irrefutable evidence that Reynolds had been accepting money in exchange for favorable rulings. The document was time-stamped just a few weeks before Alia's zoning case had been decided, and she now realized that her own case had been just another cog in the system of favoritism and greed that Reynolds had been orchestrating. Alia couldn't help but feel a sense of victory, but it was short-lived. As she stared at the document, a wave of apprehension washed over her. This evidence would be enough to expose the entire operation, but it also put her squarely in the crosshairs of powerful people. The risks were higher than ever. Reynolds wouldn't go down without a fight, and Alia knew that exposing him would create a ripple effect, dragging others into the light. She couldn't afford to make a single misstep. She had to be careful. She needed to confirm the document, make sure she had everything in order before taking the next step. But there was no time to waste. If she hesitated, someone else might step in and try to silence her. Alia made up her mind. She couldn't sit on this information any longer. She had to act, and fast. But as she prepared to take the next steps in her investigation, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to set off a chain of events that would change everything. The weight of the decision sat heavily on Alia's shoulders. She knew what needed to be done, but the path ahead was fraught with peril. Holding the evidence in her hands, the emails, the financial documents, the web of connections between Judge Reynolds and powerful local figures, she realized that this wasn't just about exposing one man. This was about toppling a corrupt system that had been operating in the shadows for far too long. She couldn't just report the story quietly. She had to make it public, undeniable. But going public meant risk. Reynolds wasn't a man who would go down without a fight. She had already seen the way he operated. His calm, calculated demeanor in court masked a ruthless streak. Alia was well aware that anyone who threatened the system would be met with resistance. Still, the truth was on her side, and that truth needed to be heard. She arranged a press conference, careful not to alert anyone to the specifics of what she was about to reveal. She knew the stakes were high. She wasn't just exposing a corrupt judge. She was calling into question the integrity of the entire local justice system. If Reynolds had been involved in criminal activity, there were others too. Powerful people would be implicated. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about the corruption she had uncovered. This was about justice. On the day of the conference, Alia stood in front of the gathered reporters, feeling the heat of dozens of cameras trained on her. The room was buzzing with anticipation. She had been in the spotlight before, but never like this. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her papers, but her voice was steady when she began. "I'm here today," she said, "to expose the corruption that runs deep within our local justice system. For months, I've been investigating Judge Thomas Reynolds, and what I've uncovered is shocking." Alia went on to outline the connection between Reynolds and local business people, detailing how he had used his position to make rulings in their favor in exchange for financial kickbacks. She presented the damning email threads, the financial documents, and the testimony of insiders who had risked their jobs to speak out. The room fell silent as the reporters processed the information. Then the questions began to fly, fast and furious. How do you know these documents are authentic? What do you say to those who accuse you of fabricating this story? What's your evidence that Reynolds took bribes? Alia remained calm, answering each question with the clarity of someone who knew she was speaking the truth. She had done her research. She had the facts. She was ready. But even as she stood there, exposing everything, she knew the real battle had just begun. The press conference had launched a spark that would ignite a firestorm. Reynolds would fight back, and she would have no choice but to confront the fallout. The truth was now out in the open, but the consequences were far from certain. Alia couldn't afford to relax. This was only the beginning. And with every word she spoke, she realized the depth of the danger she was now in. The aftermath of the press conference was swift and intense. The local media had exploded with coverage of Alia's revelations. Headlines blared the story of a respected judge allegedly involved in a corruption scheme that extended deep into the heart of the local justice system. Social media erupted with outrage, and protests began outside the courthouse, demanding accountability and transparency. But with the public's outcry came the inevitable pushback. Judge Reynolds, surrounded by his powerful allies, wasted no time in denying the allegations. He called Alia's report reckless and unsubstantiated, labeling her a dangerous journalist intent on tarnishing his reputation for personal gain. He issued a statement claiming that the documents she presented were fabricated and that her sources were unreliable. The local government rallied behind him, at least publicly, issuing statements of support. But Alia wasn't swayed by their denials. Behind the scenes, things were moving at an even faster pace. Investigations into the claims had been launched. An internal review was conducted by the Judicial Oversight Board, and a special prosecutor was assigned to look into the corruption allegations. Alia felt a sense of vindication as the gears of justice slowly turned, but she also knew the real battle was just beginning. Reynolds and his network were powerful, and they would not go down easily. The pressure on Alia mounted. Her phone rang constantly with calls from colleagues, supporters, and detractors. Anonymous threats began flooding her inbox, warning her to drop the story or face the consequences. She had anticipated this. She had known that exposing such powerful figures would bring danger, but it didn't make it any easier to handle. She began to feel the weight of every decision she made, every person she spoke to, every move she made. As the investigation into Reynolds grew more intense, Alia's own life became a game of cat and mouse. She couldn't walk into a room without wondering who might be watching. Her sources became increasingly nervous, afraid to speak out in case their names were linked to the scandal. Her colleagues at the local newspaper were divided. Some supported her unconditionally, while others questioned whether she had gone too far, wondering if there was more to the story than she was letting on. Still, Alia pushed forward. She knew she couldn't afford to back down. She had made too many sacrifices for this story. Her personal relationships were fraying, and she had already lost the trust of some of her closest colleagues. But it didn't matter. The system had to be exposed, and Reynolds was just the beginning. Alia wasn't just fighting to bring down a corrupt judge anymore. She was fighting to hold an entire system accountable. She spent sleepless nights poring over court records, following up on leads, and digging deeper into the connections that tied Reynolds to influential figures in the business and political world. Every time she thought she had uncovered everything, another piece of the puzzle would surface. It was a relentless pursuit, but she was determined. The truth, she knew, would always find its way to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. But as the walls began to close in on Reynolds, Alia understood that the real test was still to come. This fight was about more than just one man. It was about ensuring that justice, once lost, could be restored. And she was prepared to see it through, no matter what it cost her. The days after the press conference felt like a blur to Alia. As the investigation into Judge Reynolds gained momentum, the media frenzy intensified. News outlets across the state picked up the story, and local protests outside the courthouse grew larger with each passing day. The judicial system had been rocked to its core, and there was no turning back. But the stakes were higher than ever. Reynolds and his powerful allies had begun to fight back in full force. Alia's phone rang incessantly with calls from law firms offering legal counsel, private investigators hired to track her movements, and anonymous messages warning her to stop digging into matters that could ruin her life. The weight of their threats was a constant presence, but Alia refused to back down. She had come too far, and she knew the cost of silence. Behind closed doors, the investigation continued to unfold, and Alia's relentless pursuit of the truth paid off. Her deep dives into the judge's past rulings revealed even more shocking connections: businessmen with ties to organized crime, politicians who had quietly funneled money to Reynolds' family foundation in exchange for favorable judicial decisions. It was clear that Reynolds was not just a corrupt judge. He was a linchpin in a much larger network of corruption that extended across multiple sectors of society. Then came the breaking news. The Judicial Oversight Board, under growing pressure from the public and media, announced that Judge Reynolds would be suspended from the bench pending a full investigation. It was a monumental step forward, but it wasn't enough. Aliyah knew that the legal system couldn't be trusted to bring Reynolds to justice on its own, not when so many of its own members were implicated. That's when she decided to take matters into her own hands. Aliyah had been in contact with a group of whistleblowers, former employees of Reynolds, lawyers who had quietly resigned after witnessing unethical practices, and even a few former political allies who were now turning against him. They provided her with the final pieces of the puzzle. The full extent of Reynolds' corruption was more extensive than she had ever imagined. With their help, Aliyah was able to compile irrefutable evidence, including video recordings, financial documents, and testimony from those who had once been too afraid to speak. The final straw came when Reynolds was caught on tape accepting a bribe from a prominent developer in exchange for a favorable ruling on a high-profile case. The video was clear, damning, and most importantly, public. As the video went viral, calls for his resignation flooded in. Reynolds was forced to step down, his reputation in ruins. The fallout was immediate, with other judges and politicians now scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. What had started as a quiet investigation had turned into a full-scale reckoning for a corrupt system. For Aliyah, it was a bittersweet victory. The fight had taken everything from her: personal relationships, career stability, even her sense of safety. But in the end, she had brought the truth to light. The people who had once been silenced now had a voice, and justice, however delayed, was finally within reach. Aliyah stood outside the courthouse, the weight of the moment settling in. She had been tested in ways she never expected, but she had succeeded. The system had been exposed, and it was up to the people to rebuild it. She was proud of what she had accomplished, but she knew that this was only the beginning of a long journey toward real change. As the sun began to set, Aliyah took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next.